Hello everybody, my name is Paul. Welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic day. I hope that you guys are safe, that your friends and your family are safe, and if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. There's a ton of stuff that is happening all throughout the world, and a ton of stuff happening inside of the country of Ukraine, as I'm sure you guys can guess. And over the past 48 hours, we've seen several major developments when it comes to the war in Ukraine, especially, as I'm sure you may have already heard, the major missile strikes that have occurred throughout the country. We'll get to that, and there's plenty of stuff that is causing a ton of suffering to people throughout the world. If you guys have never joined us before, here's a little bit about the project. So the whole point of the project here is to help people, to help raise money, to help people all throughout the world that are affected by a number of crises. And these could be conflicts such as the war in Ukraine or what is happening in other places throughout the world. We have plenty of places in the Middle East, of course, and Africa as well. Or whether you're talking about things such as climate change and climate crises, or you're talking about natural disasters that are happening across the planet. We want to give back to the very people affected by the news stories that we talk about every single night, and we want to be the news that gives back. That's our mission statement and our motto, and that is what we put forth here every single night. And the way that we're able to do that is through you guys. If you check out the video description below, you're going to see a ton of different organizational links. Most of those, I should say, have been suggested by you guys as the viewers, and through those links, you are able to donate to a wide variety of different organizations that cover different areas of the globe. And we're constantly looking for more. In fact, we had one suggestion earlier already today that is looking very hopeful, and we hope to have added here in the very near future. Well, two things that we look for within all of these organizations is that, one, it is a credible organization or individual you can donate to, and you can be rest assured that the funds are going to where they are supposed to. The second thing that we can assure you is that 80% or more of the donations that each of these organizations or individuals receive go directly to their programs, with 20% or less going to administration's costs and salaries, which is why you may see some very notable organizations that may not be on that list. And so with that, we implore you to check out not just the ones for Ukraine, though there's a wide variety, whether you want to help out the war effort or help out humanitarian efforts or what have you. We implore you to check out not just Ukraine, but the wide variety of other crises going on throughout the world. According to the United Nations, 345 million people, the highest ever recorded number of refugees and internally displaced people in history, is out there right now, and all of them are suffering from at least acute malnutrition and hunger and food insecurities, meaning that at this point in time, the highest number of people need our help throughout the world, and not all of that is focused in Europe. And so please be sure to check those out. Here on the channel, we're never doing super chats. We're never doing any kind of merchandising or any kind of monetization for personal gain. 100% of everything that we will always do here at the New News will always go to charities and go to helping people. We don't want to profit off of anyone's misery here. And so with that, we get ready to roll into the news. And before we do, I want to let you know that if you are joining with us live tonight, I am watching the live chat as I always am, and I will respond to questions and comments presented in the live chat itself. So please feel free to ask any questions. I will do my best to answer them. To give you a little background on myself, if you've never joined here before, so I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I served with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines as a corporal and an O-352 anti-tank missileman. I did 2 deployments to the Middle East during my time in the Marine Corps. My first deployment was between October of 2017 and March of 2018, where I spent 4.5 months in the country of Syria, specifically in northeastern Syria and Deir ez-Zor and al-Hasaka provinces. And there I supported Operation Inherent Resolve and Special Operations Forces engaged in the fight against the Islamic State. After that, I spent about 1.5 months in transit back to the United States and Kuwait. My second deployment was between October of 2019 and March of 2020. There, I served as the Javelin team leader for the Crisis Response Company out of Kuwait, where I spent the majority of my time. After some time in Kuwait on New Year's of 2020, I responded as one of the 100 Marines that went to the Baghdad Embassy complex, where 4,000 protesters attempted to overrun the U.S. Embassy there in Baghdad, where I oversaw all anti-armor operations across the Baghdad Embassy complex and was in charge of the Javelin teams there at the U.S. Embassy. After that, I went to Saudi Arabia to train Saudi Arabian Marines as they were preparing to deploy to Yemen as part of the Saudi coalition against the Houthi rebels there in the country, and before I was rotated home. In the interim time, I held a B-billet where I was in charge of the weapons company armory, so I am very well versed in all heavy weapons equipment that is inherent to a Marine battalion. So with that, I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armor doctrine. I'm a fully cross-trained machine gunner. I'm a fully cross-trained rifleman. I'm a partially cross-trained radio operator, and I am also a CLS, or Combat Lifesaver Certified Marine, meaning I've received extensive medical training to be able to assist Navy corpsmen in their tasks above what a normal Marine will receive. So I can answer a very wide variety of questions. I can talk much better at the tactical level, as I was a small unit leader. I was never formally trained at any strategic affairs, though I do make my inferences and give my best guesses. Outside of that, I try to remain well-rounded, as I have a very big like for history. I love history, always have. It's something that I have always grown up with. I'm also very interested in human geography, geopolitics, and a wide spectrum of other things, including archaeology and paleontology. I love to learn more and new things, so please feel free to ask questions outside of that, but I will never claim to be a subject matter expert. Subject matter expert or not, it doesn't really matter, because I always implore my viewers to please do your own research if any topics interest you. If you check out in the video description, you're going to see a ton of different links down there that aren't just for the, that part of those are actually for the channel themselves. Pardon me, including our Discord, but also our website, and there you can actually find our daily maps. I publish them every day before the stream, so that way you can either follow along with us, go back through and review, and click any of the associated links. So if you would like a starting place, then feel free to go and check out our maps and look at our sources just as I bring them up here in the videos every single night. And if not, then of course you can always research on your own too. And with that, we get ready to move into the news. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing any new quotes coming from the Kremlin or our Army Commander Conscriptovich today, but that usually is what starts us off as we move into Ukraine, which is our special report for the night. And there's been a ton of different developments, especially coming out of the Kyiv Oblast, and we can take a look at some of those as we start our day off today. And while there was an extensive missile strike, once again, one of the most intense of the entire war occurring today, it was definitely not entirely successful, as we've seen before. 60 out of 72 cruise missiles were actually shot down. 76 munitions in total were shot down. Right now, they're saying 72 cruise missiles and 4 guided air-to-surface missiles were destroyed early this morning that were launched from the Caspian and Black Seas. Ukraine Defense Forces shut down over 60 of them. Over 40 missiles were launched against Kyiv, and 37 of them reportedly were intercepted. At least 3 people were reported to have been killed. This is coming from the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Federation of Ukraine. So very much a very high interception rate, as we can see. One of the difficulties and the purpose of so many of these strikes being launched against Ukraine is it's meant to actually see significant losses in them, though. That's the disturbing part. Russia is launching these missiles with the full understanding that most of them have been shot down, and they're going to be shot down. So the reason that they continue to launch these massive strikes, knowing this and knowing that they're using valuable munitions, is it oversaturates air defenses. So just like anything else, there comes a day, or there comes a time where no matter how good your equipment is, no matter how good your radar is, or no matter how many batteries you have out there, there's just too much going on at once. War is best described as a controlled chaos, and these kind of things are very chaotic. They're very disorienting in many ways, and technology helps, but at the end of the day, when you have so many missiles, 76 missiles in total incoming, the air defense systems just cannot keep up. There's just too much at once, and so while the majority of them are shot down, some inevitably will slip through, and that is the Russian tactic at this point. They know that they know that most of these won't hit their targets, but some will. Rooster Fontaine asked, did Ukraine get Patriot batteries yet? Not that we can officially say. I did check both the official Twitters of Alexei Reznikov, who is in charge, who is the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, and also the fact that I also checked that Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian Armed Forces official Twitters too, and their official websites and sources, and they have not officially stated that any Patriot systems have entered into Ukraine. Though there has been some that I believe that is actually still in discussion, and that no physical material moves have occurred yet, at least from what we can track. Bookham 40 says it's a weird trade-off, and maybe they're playing the long game. Well, we'll actually get to that here in a few minutes when we talk about some of the long game. And we talk about where Ukraine is at in the war, because the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has actually made several statements on that. He did so yesterday. Once again, 4 were injured in the missile attack. They were later reported to be killed, according to the Kiev Oblast governor, Alexei Kuleba. We do get a child casualty update, which we report in a very somber tone, as unfortunately that is these things, as terrible statistics as they are something that needs to be heard and needs to be repeated time and time again. And these statements are released by the Prosecutor General's office. Quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 449 Ukrainian children have died, 859 children have been injured. Most victims among the children are from the Donetsk region, which has seen very significant fighting over the course of the war, especially intensified fighting over the last several months. And of course, this is also the region which has been embattled for the last 9 years since the Maidan Revolution. Ukraine is plunged into darkness once again. Of course, these missiles all had a target, and the vast majority of them, their primary target was to hit Ukrainian energy infrastructure, as has been the goal for some time now. It's attempting to cripple Ukraine's capacity to continue the war, but also to cause issues at home. These are actually a war crime under Additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, or the 4th Geneva Conventions. Additional Protocol 1 was adopted in 1977. This distinguishes the difference between a military target and a civilian target when it comes to infrastructure. The difference between the two is the primary usage. If the primary usage of said infrastructure is to support civilian life in and around an area and would cause immense detriment to the civilian life in and of an area, then therefore it should be considered to be a civilian target, and to strike it as such would be a war crime. The difference being that things such as the Kerch Bridge, which while was utilized for civilian traffic, the vast majority of what was trafficked across that bridge, especially on the 2 rail lines that run adjacent to it, is the fact that it was being used to supply the Russian military through Crimea across the bridge from homeland in Russia. So that therefore designates that as its primary usage as being a military target, therefore susceptible to being struck. And that goes a long way with many, many other things, but those are just one instance that is easy to recall. But, quote, as a result of today's shelling, energy facilities in the east and south of Ukraine have been damaged, and emergency power outages were introduced across the country. That comes from Herman Halushenko, who is the Minister of Energy of Ukraine. We are finally getting something that has been a very long time in the running, and the investigative team set out by the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Special Inquiry into Ukraine and its war crimes has released another very public statement and update regarding what has happened inside of Ukraine. They focus on different areas for each of their reports, some of which are more pressing at the time, some of which are looking back into the previous history of what has happened. This specifically centers around what happened between February 24th and April the 6th of this year in the areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy Oblast prior to the Russian withdrawal from these areas. And that is that the United Nations has finally provided an update regarding summary executions of civilians inside of Ukraine. We do have that from the United Nations Human Rights Council, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who we have here for you. This is a short part that was released on their official Twitter. Let's take a look.
As requested, I present to you my office's report focused on killings of civilians by Russian armed forces through summary executions and attacks on individual civilians, which took place in 102 villages and towns in Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions between 24 February and 6 April 2022. The findings are based on information gathered during field visits to the three regions following the retreat of Russian troops, interviews with witnesses and survivors, and other sources of information. We documented the killings of 441 civilians, 341 men, 72 women, 20 boys, and 8 girls. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher, as we're working to corroborate an additional 198 alleged killings in these regions. We are also documenting new cases in parts of Kharkiv and Kherson regions that were recently retaken by Ukrainian forces. 100 of the documented killings in the three regions are presented in the report in detail. In some cases, Russian soldiers executed civilians in makeshift places of detention. Others were summarily executed on the spot, following security checks in their houses, yards, and doorways, even where the victim had shown clearly that they were not a threat, for example, by holding their hands in the air. There are therefore strong indications that the summary executions documented in the report may constitute the war crime of willful killing.
Going from the High Commissioner of Human Rights for the United Nations, Viktor Turk. And we do actually get this statement where it's very long. He goes through quite a number of things that is attached to it. The official transcript is here on the United Nations website. But let's just think about that. The fact of the matter is that men and boys, so a couple of details here. So 441 civilians, 341 of which are men, 72 were women, and 20 were boys, and 8 were girls. That's quite an excessive number of people. I mean, 441 people executed by the Russian Federation. These are not one-off instances. These are not one-off instances of rogue individuals. This is systematic, and that is the whole thing. Under the 1993, so you have war crimes. These are individual crimes committed in war based off of international conventions and customary international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions on certain conventional weapons from 1980, and you also have things such as you also have other international treaties to go along with that, especially bilateral treaties between certain countries. For instance, if there was a bilateral treaty of war regarding Ukraine and Russia, should a conflict ever break out, that would be something that could be looked at as a war crime within those countries, and which should be recognized. So if they are party to these, which they are, then so each instance constitutes a war crime. Under the 1993 Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, under the 1993 Rome Statute, when war crimes become systematic, meaning they become used extensively as a weapon of war, they are no longer just considered to be war crimes, but under the 1993 Rome Statute, they're actually considered to be crimes against humanity, which is what they are actually looking at now. Not just crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is both a more general term and a lesser term in some cases. It can be used as a lesser term should the individual not have committed ethnic cleansing or genocide. They can still be charged with crimes against humanity, but should they have committed the ethnic cleansing and genocide, crimes against humanity is also included, as those are crimes against humanity. But there's even more details written throughout this. Men and boys comprise 88% of all victims of summary executions. Bucha was the worst hit, where we documented the killings of 73 civilians, 54 men, 16 women, 2 boys, and 1 girl between 4th and 30th of March over a 150-meter stretch of Yablunska Street. 14 civilians, 10 men, 3 women, and 1 girl were shot dead and left where they fell. My office is in the process of corroborating 105 additional alleged victims of civilians in Bucha. So 73 have been confirmed by the United Nations, with an additional 105 still under investigation but highly suspected of being included in that number. That is horrific, to say the least. That is mind-boggling. Now, these numbers certainly are starting to corroborate very closely to what Ukraine has presented and stated to the International Criminal Court within their evidence and what they've been stating to the world. And it was very clear when we went over those images ourselves here on the channel, it was very clear what was happening. And to see the legal process finally catching up so many months later, and I do understand it does take quite a significant amount of time to do legal processes at a world stage, to see it happen so many months later, it's slightly like closure, but not quite, because there are no convictions yet in a court of law. But it is certainly damning when the United Nations Independent Inquiry and High Commissioner for Human Rights is stating as such. Now, talking about, as we said earlier, with the long game versus the short game. So something that had been stated by Bookham 40 is it's a weird trade-off, and maybe they are playing the long game. Well, very much likely that is the case. And it's been said before by outside sources, third parties, that the war in Ukraine is going to last for a long time. And it's not going to be a short war, as much as we would all hope. We would all hope it would end today, or at the very least by Christmas. But that's not the case. And even Valery Zaluzhny, who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, he is the highest-ranking general. He is the one in charge of the military forces in Ukraine. He's even said as such. On Thursday, he gave a very grave and concerning announcement, warning of a possible attack on the Kyiv region from Belarus as soon as January or February. Quote, Russian mobilization has worked. We estimate that they have reserves of 1.2 million to 1.5 million people. Russians are preparing some 200,000 fresh troops, and I have no doubt they will have another go at Kyiv. On their weapons and preparedness, quote, their combat potential will be very, very low. Even if he enlists 1 million more men, it will not bring the desired result. May the soldiers in the trenches forgive me. It's more important to focus on the accumulation of resources right now for the more protracted and heavier battles that may begin next year. So this is in response. There has been several videos, and I thought about showing one today. There have been several videos where Ukrainian soldiers have been saying, hey, we're missing some pretty vital things that we need right now on the front lines. And he here is addressing that. And he's saying, listen, this is a war that's going to take a long time. This is a war that's going to be protracted. We know it's going to be protracted, and we need to also look at the long term. We cannot, be the star that burns brightest right before it goes out. We need to be ready to play the long game. This is not a short endeavor. If we want to have a chance to win, we have to stockpile equipment. And he's addressing some of these videos that have been released, and they can be, we have no way of truly verifying, but we can say with some very very good degrees of confidence that Ukrainian troops are actually stating that they are missing some certain things that they would need, and that some things seem to be lacking in some areas. And this is something that's been addressed before. This is something that they continue to pester other countries about and say, hey, this is what we need, this is what we need, this is what we need, which therefore has to go through bureaucratic circles. but there's also some things that Ukraine is doing for a reason, because they know what they're getting into and what they're looking at ahead of them. He also stressed that it's impossible to conduct new major operations with the resources Ukraine has now. He says, stressing the dire need for more tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and howitzers. To be precise, he said, for a successful counteroffensive, Ukraine will need 300 tanks, 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers to be able to actually throw into the fight for a successful counteroffensive. The difficulty will continue as the war progresses, not just because both sides are slowly but surely bleeding each other dry in a war of attrition, but because, if you notice, the area that Russia has to defend has decreased in significant size. This is good for Ukraine because it means they're retaking additional territory. It's bad for Ukraine in some circumstances because that is now less territory that Russia has to defend, and so every inch of ground now has more resources that can be dedicated to it, making the battles bloodier and bloodier and bloodier and more costly as the war continues. We've seen significant amounts of heavy fighting in areas throughout the Donbass. This is Donetsk and Luhansk, and we will continue to see that probably for several months further unless there are some major changes in the war effort there in the south. And this is where the achievement tonight comes in. As you may have noticed in our thumbnail, there's a new achievement. The last one was the HIMARS, which struck into, or which were, sorry, not HIMARS, but which were rockets that were launched by Ukraine that struck into Crimea for the first time, when we didn't realize that Ukraine quite had that capability at that point in the war. We know much better now. And yet another achievement has now been unlocked in Ukraine today. Spray and pray. Shoot down an enemy cruise missile with a machine gun. And that is exactly what one man at a machine gun post at a checkpoint outside of Kyiv did today. During those missile strikes early this morning, this man mounted his PKM machine gun, his PKP medium machine gun at his post at a checkpoint outside of Kyiv at one of the outlying regions, and began to fire at the cruise missiles, successfully striking one and bringing it down to where it crash landed in a field. And we can see that here. He recalls seeing green sparks as he hit it, and it spun out of control.
З дозволу командира. Так точно. На запобежник. Ну, конечно, быстро он среагировал. Молодец, парнишка молодой, резвый, реакция мгновенная. Так что такие дела. Летели от нее зеленые искры, когда он стрелял, было видно все. Вот, и она потом начала кружиться, вот так вот, заходить, короче, хвостом. Ну, когда в нее попал, искры полетели, она зашла хвостом и упала. Крыло уходит в фонд нуждающихся. Мне как раз запчасти на БМВ надо, бартер, там все дела.
Да?
Да, ну, нормально. Будем...
To be that guy. Rooster Fontaine says a cheap C-RAM. Yes, it is a very cheap C-RAM. It's also very lucky, but very good shooting. And you can see what's left of that missile as it has impacted into the earth there. He's not the only one. Many people within the Territorial Defense Forces there inside of the inside of areas such as Kyiv and the air defense systems were extremely successful today in shooting down the vast majority of those missiles. So very successful, but yet another achievement unlocked. So we have a question from Delta Aviation 23. And he says, if Russia attacks Kyiv again, is Ukraine more prepared this time? I wouldn't say that Ukraine wasn't, like, they were prepared for it, but this war didn't quite, it wasn't quite what everyone expected it to be. The warning signs were there, but it wasn't quite what everyone had expected it to be, I think. especially for Ukraine, given where they were. But yes, they are more prepared this time. Ukraine actually has been conducting a lot of training for. We see this. We don't report on it nearly as much because there are certain aspects of this war that should remain relatively operationally secure, even though they are being announced on very public channels. I think it's something that I don't want to report on. I don't want to report on exactly where, for the most part, where Ukrainian forces are in rear echelon areas of Ukraine, not on the front lines. I don't want to report exactly where they're at on the front lines unless it's relatively obvious either. As we go through, there has to be some discretion. I want to report the truth. I want to tell you what's happening. And I want to be informative and to allow you to have an understanding. But operational security is paramount because you not following that and not keeping that in mind will lead to people being killed. I understand that not everyone who necessarily may watch these streams or anything that may be watching these streams may be as good-hearted as the vast majority of my viewers. So I do keep that in mind, and I do want to be careful what I put out on the open internet. But there are Ukrainian forces in the back lines, and we do know they have been conducting extensive amounts of training. I've seen a lot of training from them in areas within the rear echelon areas to the western part of Ukraine, northwestern part of Ukraine. I've also seen extensive defensive networks that have been set up along the Ukrainian-Belarusian border, and for a lot of military activity within those areas. So there are units that are rotated there that are conducting additional training, resting, refitting, and all of that are rotated off of the line because Ukraine is actually rotating their troops quite extensively. And we do know that there are troops pre-placed in these parts of Ukraine now and have been in these locations for a while, specifically in the event that Belarus or Russia tries to invade from the north again. So they are prepared should it happen. Exactly to what extent, I don't know. I don't think anyone truly does. That's good for good reason for Ukraine's part. But yes, Ukraine is prepared should an invasion be launched in the north again, should the Russians attempt another grab at Kyiv, which this is not the time to do it by any means. But yes, they are prepared. To what extent, we don't know, but I would say that they are much better prepared as they remember what happened last time. So there are troops in that area. There's extensive amounts of troops in that area. And not all troops are dedicated to the front line now. You don't throw everything you have. You don't show all of your cards all at the same time. That's a very quick way to lose the war. I see some nice. I'm seeing some Command and Conquer ideology coming through here from William Young. He's talking about saying these are real fodder Zerg tactics that need USA and Germany to build a giant wall of photon cannons. Yeah. Russia would be throwing non-combat experienced troops. Belarusian troops have never seen combat. Yes, that is true as well. Russia would be fielding non-combat experienced troops. Their best troops, their best equipment is gone. It's destroyed, or it's in very limited numbers. Their best troops killed, captured, wounded, combat ineffective. Their command structure, they've suffered high levels of attrition within their command, considering their ranks. You're talking several generals, I think upwards of 9 generals killed now in action. So it's not looking good for them, because that guy that died has probably been in his position for a while, knows what he needs to do better than the guy that's going to replace him. And, we've also seen a lot of generals that have been replaced now. Once again, yes, that means that he is less prepared for the job than the guy that he's replacing is. So that, or than the guy who he was replacing is. He has less experience. We see that at all levels of the chain of command. The Russians are very top heavy. They have a lot of officers. They really do not have any non-commissioned officers, no NCOs, sergeants and corporals and stuff like that to carry out those orders in an effective way. And therefore, you're seeing very high attrition rates among officers, and you're seeing very much a there's not really any flexibility within the Russian military. They carry out the orders that they're given, and they continue to do that until they either are successful or they don't exist anymore as a unit, which is what we see on the front lines now. So what we see here, this is kind of interesting. So I don't know if this has anything to do with the war, but it was something worth noting, and it gives me a chance to talk about something I really don't talk about a lot in this. So I labeled this Texas tea, also known as black gold or oil. So oil reportedly began to pump from the town well in the village of Koshchenivka here in the Sumy Oblast. It's unknown how or why this began to occur, but it did, and there's a video of it. Now, it's possible this probably isn't connected to the war, but it brings up an interesting point, because it could be. And the reason why is ecological damage. Something that Ukraine reports on that we really don't talk about a whole lot here on the channel, and it's something that we should consider, is ecological damage to Ukraine. The fact of the matter, we talk about destroyed homes and destroyed cultural sites and destroyed infrastructure and civilian casualties and a lot of very, very, very horrendous things that happen to the people of Ukraine. But we don't talk about a lot when it comes to ecological issues too. Because these rockets and mortars aren't just hitting towns and villages and people. They're destroying large swaths of forest and wildlife, and they're cratering fields, and they're destroying, protected areas. We look at the Chernobyl exclusion zone, an area specifically there to keep people out because it's so dangerous. The topsoil is relatively no longer radioactive, but below that it's heavily radioactive from the fallout from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in the 1980s. And we saw when Russian forces dug into this that their troops got radiation sickness and died because they dug into radioactive earth and made trench works. And that is kicking up, and the gear, the treads on these tanks and the wheels on these vehicles, as they're driving down these dirt roads, as they're driving through these open fields in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, are kicking up radioactive dust and turning that topsoil that is protecting, that is, limiting the radioactive activity or the radiation within the exclusion zone. That's, the battles that took place there now kicked all that up. It's much more radioactive there now. And it's a much more dangerous environment than it really needs to be, considering the fact that there was already one nuclear disaster there. So this is stuff that is going to affect Ukraine for a very long time. It affects everything. We're talking about entire ecosystems have been destroyed. We're talking about, massive amounts of pollution. You think pollution industrial is bad. Oil from the vehicles, the diesel fuel burning, the oil being just, the oil tanks being destroyed, that seeps into the ground, seeps into the aquifers, and poisons groundwater. Makes entire swaths of land unusable and in environmental disaster zones for decades, if not centuries, depending on what the substance is. The amount of material that has been, just the amount of chemicals that have been just lurched into that are leaching into the ground from unexploded ordnance is horrific. This is long lasting effects. The unexploded ordnance will be a multi-generational issue. The unexploded ordnance in and of itself will be a multi-generational issue. It will affect people for decades. Children will die because of this war 40 years from now. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Look at kids in Vietnam. Heavy usage of landmines by both sides during the war in Vietnam. And guess what? Every single year, there are children who step on unexploded landmines that go off. And it kills them. And it maims them. And it injures them. Still, that was over 60 years ago. Well, look now. You war in Ukraine. The amount of unexploded ordnance is insane to think about, even in the scale of the war in Vietnam. War only gets more efficient and deadlier. But while it will be a multi-generational issue with unexploded ordnance, ecological destruction, some of it will be several years. Some of it will be decades. A lot of it will be hundreds of years of ecological disaster and recovery. And in many cases, depending on the severity of damage, the environments, the habitats, the ecosystems of Ukraine and many places where the fighting has been exceptionally heavy will never truly recover. They'll never truly recover. So that is the reality. So, while maybe not directly correlated to the war in Ukraine, we don't talk about it, and much of the world doesn't talk about it, but the effects of what is happening in Ukraine will be felt for generations. It will be felt for decades, if not centuries in many cases. Long after this is in the history books, long after this is taught in school as another horrific war and genocide against a people, while long after the rallying cries have died off and life has returned to relative normal and peace, this country will still be affected by the war in many ways. Every animal, every bird, every dolphin, every squirrel, every natural creature that lives in and around the Black Sea and around Ukraine will be affected by this war for a very long time to come. And I mentioned dolphins because that's one of the examples given by Ukraine very often, is the amount of dolphins which have washed ashore in places like Odessa that have died as a result of the concussions from launches and blasts in the Black Sea from the Black Sea Fleet launching missiles against Ukraine, and from the explosions at ports in places like Odessa and Berdyansk and many, many other places. The brings us over here into the Kharkiv Oblast, over here in Kupiansk, where we haven't really gotten to talk a whole lot for a while. Kupiansk, unfortunately, was hit with S-300 missiles. The S-300 is a surface-to-air missile system. It was created by the Soviet Union, and it's one of the top missile systems in the world. It's heavily utilized by both sides. However, due to the fact that Russia is running out of long-range precision strike munitions, the S-300 missiles, which have quite an incredible range in and of themselves, have had partial parts of their stocks repurposed in order to hit ground targets. They're not very accurate, only accurate within 200 to 500 meters of their intended target, but the S-300 does carry quite a significant payload. We've seen their destructive results in places such as Mykolaiv and Kharkiv before, when we get to see them here in Kupiansk, where unfortunately a dog was trapped under the rubble and injured after S-300 slammed into a pharmacy here in Kupiansk. The dog was recovered after the all clear, and it was alive, and it was unburied, and was returned to its rightful owner. But we do have some of that here for you. That poor, very scared puppy. And that allows us to jump down here and into the Donbass. See, Oscar Fry says, man, I know it won't happen, but I hope that in this Ukraine-Russia war, we get a Christmas truce. Yeah, I wish we would too. I wish the war would just end, though. There's enough, this world has enough death, destruction, and suffering. We really didn't need to add it onto an industrial scale again. For a world that said never forget, we seem to have forgotten relatively easily the horrors of World War II. Bookham 40 says, long term, years maybe, will Russia give up? Putin's death won't change anything. I fear fatigue from the West will be the deciding factor. You say fatigue from the West, but the West also fought a 20-year-long war against insurgents in Afghanistan. And we continue to fight a global war on terror, and there are still troops that are in Syria. There are still troops that are in Iraq. There are troops that are fighting the Islamic State in Africa, and have been relatively quietly, because that really doesn't get covered very much. But there's a crisis response force for Africa, just like there is for the Middle East. It's just the Middle East has been where most of the fighting has been for the last 30 years. So it gets covered the most. Everyone's already there. The infrastructure for covering it's already there. And it makes for a hot topic. Mr. Fry says, you mean World War I, not World War II. No, everyone said never forget for World War II. World War I, they also said never forget, and then 20 years later there was another war. So, and that one was incredibly worse. Book of 40 says political will is finicky. Yes, political will is finicky. But this war is one that has been expected. The reason, for so many military builders, the whole reason for NATO existing was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was very openly stating that they were willing to conquer the rest of the world, and they're willing to do it through military force. And they literally broke apart because they tried to outspend much better economies and couldn't keep up, and starved millions of people doing so just to achieve some kind of results. NATO, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, lost its purpose and really didn't have anywhere to go. And sure, they did some things. They supported UN efforts in places like the breakup of Yugoslavia, which turned into Moldova and turned into Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, and had interventions with places Afghanistan, Libya with a no-fly zone, over Iraq during the invasion, no-fly zone. But NATO really hasn't had a purpose. Russia's back, and they're very openly being aggressive again. NATO has its purpose again. And these countries now because the vast majority, United States may be the power, may be the powerhouse. The United States has diverted attentions in two different directions. You have China in the Pacific, and you have Russia in Europe, but most of the countries here in Europe have dedicated quite extensively to Ukraine. I mean, you're talking majority of GDPs in some cases, or majority of defense spending worth of equipment going to Ukraine, covering each other to be able to send jets to Ukraine so that in anticipation of getting replacement aircraft. You're seeing a revitalization process. And while bureaucracy is very finicky, and I agree, then sometimes it takes a lot longer than it probably should, even when it's a no-brainer decision. I'm also not a politician, and I also there's definitely things that I don't know about that definitely have to be discussed. And it's important to have those discussions, and I understand that takes time. I don't think that there will be fatigue. This is too much of a danger and too much of a reality for many, many more people than the vast majority of the viewer base that I have. And I do know that the vast majority of my viewers are from the United States. But for people in Poland, in Lithuania, and Latvia, this is on their doorstep. They are seeing this war happen. There are videos that came out today, the strikes that were happening on Kyiv. You could see them if you were in a plane flying in Moldova. This is not something that's happening a world away. It's happening next door. And that is the reality of this. And you have two countries that are very willing to fight an aggressive war of attrition and bring that same brutality that we see in Ukraine into your own country. And that is something that is going to drive people to continue to support this, because it is in their benefit to support it, because it's not them, but it very well could be. Rich Fontaine asked, would you kick Turkey out of NATO? That's a very tough question, and this is my personal opinion, so please take it with a personal opinion in mind. The answer for me personally is yes. I would. Turkey is strategically viable, yes, because of its placement in the world. It is an extremely strategically important place, as it has access to both the Caucasus in the Middle East as well as Europe, and also the majority of access from the Black Sea connecting the Mediterranean. You have to go through Turkey to get to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. But Turkey's government right now, under Erdogan, is not a country that I think represents the values shared within the NATO alliance. That is my belief. Turkey refuses to admit its wrongdoings in the past, attempting to save face. The Armenian genocide, for instance, is something that Turkey has never been willing to admit to. The oppression of the Kurdish people is very openly, and in cases, ethnic cleansing of the Kurdish people is something that it should be recognized, and Turkey should understand that that is not correct. You can't do this under any pretext. And they make incursions into places that, the NATO alliance, in many cases, the United States, for instance, is in Iraq at the request of Iraq. Turkey's not. And that's a huge difference. While, yes, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, Saddam Hussein out of power and occupied the country. That did happen. But when the Islamic State came to power and overran the majority of the Iraqi army and took over large swaths of Iraq, Iraq asked the United States to come back to fight the Islamic State. They are a host nation. They're partnered with us. We're not forcing ourselves into being there. We're there at their request to assist them. And you see that quite extensively. Turkey's not. And Turkey's just is just conducting incursions into Syria. And into Iraq. They didn't bother to assist the coalition when the Islamic State was fighting on their doorstep and taking wide swaths of land. Turkey did nothing. But when the Kurds came to power, assisting the United States in attacking and fighting the Islamic State, now that the Kurds control Al-Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor provinces, now they believe it's the time that they need to step up and fight terrorism against the Kurds, who they believe are all terrorists. That doesn't represent values that I think, considering all other NATO countries have been supporting the Kurds, except for Turkey. And that was one of the issues with Finland and Sweden joining the NATO alliance, and one of the things that is making it difficult for them is because Turkey is forcing them to stop supporting the Kurds to join the NATO alliance. So Turkey, their government is becoming more authoritarian. They're becoming more extremists, and they hold on to things like the Ottoman Empire, I think, too much. It's always good to have pride in many ways of what you've done in history and what has led to your history. And Turkey has a very storied and important history, being in Anatolia and being part of Rome under Constantinople, there in what is now Istanbul, and all sorts of very storied and important history. But just like the United States, with its slavery and its horrific treatment of minority groups, including ensuring that the Chinese wouldn't be a minority group until the middle of the 20th century, the reality is that every country has a dark past. Germany has a dark past with the Nazis and the Reichs, and many countries in what was Yugoslavia have a dark past with ethnic cleansing and genocide, and there are a ton of horrific things that have happened throughout history. But that is the thing. It is history. It is important to acknowledge that such things happen and that people can seem good but truly be evil. And that is just the reality of what things are, or what things have happened. The Armenian genocide occurred. And understanding that and acknowledging that, I don't think is a weakness for Turkey, but it is a strength, a show of moving on and trying to improve things. To understanding that not an entire people or a terrorist organization, just like Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a terrible thing. There are real terrorists in the world, and there is real Muslim extremism, but Islam is not to blame. It is extremism that is to blame, and it is terrorists who are to blame that give such beliefs a bad name. But they're a very small percentage, and the Kurdish people are no different. Vast majority of them are democratic. Vast majority of them believe in the same values that you and I do, even if they have different customs and traditions and different philosophies that we may not have had in our own upbringing, being mostly Western viewers. But that's no reason to oppress a people. And that's no reason to do many things. And that's something that the world has an issue with right now and has for some time. But in an organization that's supposed to uphold these kinds of values and to uphold the good of the world and the UN Charter and to build strong, democratic, free nations, Turkey being in the NATO alliance very much offsets that, because they don't stand for those beliefs. And they refuse to stand alongside the NATO alliance in many regards, and therefore have become the weak point. So, no, I do not believe that Turkey should be part of the NATO alliance. I hope that gives a good answer for you. But we return back to the news as we move into the Donetsk region, where we've seen quite an extensive amount of fighting, which has continued for several months now. Of course, we get out of Kramatorsk, the de facto head of government within the Donetsk region, as the city of Donetsk is under occupation and has been for some time. Coming from Pavel Krolenko, who is the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration, he says, quote, on December the 15th, the number of victims of Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 7 killed and 7 injured. I do get this from his official Twitter. And so far, at this point in the war, not including occupied areas, Donetsk, for instance, Volnovakha, Mariupol, where we know that casualties are significantly higher amongst civilians, so far in just the free regions of the Donetsk Oblast, 1,264 Ukrainian civilians have lost their lives. 2,749 have been injured. And that is just since February the 24th. That does not include over the last 9 years of fighting in this region. We come here to the front lines, where some rather terrible news has occurred here to the north of Soledar. This is Yakovlivka, which is here to the north of Soledar. To give you an idea, Soledar was the northern tip of the front lines here around the Bakhmut area. And to the north, the Wagner group has now entered Yakovlivka here to the north. And they were posing with the administration's building for the city itself, which shows that Russian forces are mostly in control, if not in total control, of the city itself. Bitter fighting has been taking place, and Russian forces have been attempting to encircle Ukrainian troops and outflank their defenses of the city around Soledar, Bakhmutsky, and down here to the south, now Azarivka and Kurdyamivka down here to the south. You can see these two bulges. It would appear that due to the stiff defenses in Soledar, the Wagner Group has decided to push to the north. The Wagner Group is a very specific organization. They are a private military corporation, or a PMC group. They were founded by a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin in 2014. If you remember, that is the same year that Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, seizing Crimea and putting it under occupation, and supporting rebels which were near defeat there here in the Donbass and turning around the war. That would also be the exact same year that the MH17 aircraft would be shot down by Russian forces, or Russian-backed forces here within the Donbass. The Wagner Group conducts operations worldwide. They're notorious for their brutality, and we've seen that shown here on this channel a multitude of times. Executing their own for being captured or to surrender. They will execute them very brutally, as they did with a sledgehammer with one individual exchanged in a prisoner swap. They recruit from prisons, which we've also shown here. Yevgeny Prigozhin himself going to a prison, saying, if you serve 6 months with us, we will grant you freedom. Individuals convicted of attempted murder or murder in the second degree being provided awards by the state for their service within the Wagner Group as they are assisting the war in Ukraine. While normally under international conventions, mercenaries do not get the favor of the Geneva Conventions, the fact is that as long as they are citizens of a country involved in the war, they are protected by the conventions as stated. So therefore, they are not considered in this war to be considered mercenaries, but instead government contractors. The exact same loophole used for government contractors by the United States and coalition partners in the Middle East is being used to fund and funnel troops into the war here in Ukraine. The Wagner Group exists as an extension of the Russian army. Their purpose is to provide plausible deniability. Used against American forces, and on February the 7th, 2018, Russian forces, specifically the Wagner Group, as well as pro-Assad regime forces, attacked the United States outposts, which had special operations forces, Kurdish forces, as well as United States Marines located in the Conoco oil fields in Syria, just north of the city of Qashqai. An engagement ensued, which saw massive amounts of air power, which bombed and therefore killed wounded over 300 Russian contractors. Following the withdrawal of French forces in Mali just earlier this year, the Russian Wagner Group moved into a recently abandoned French base. There, they attempted to stage a mass grave and blame it on the French population and on the French forces. A French drone managed to catch them from the air, setting this up before they are able to release their statement. This is the same group which has been leading the forefront of the assaults in the Bakhmut area, and we can see them here. Their distinctive patches, of course, on their arm. The Wagner Group has a very distinctive patch. It is red and white on a black background. It features a skull, and it says the Wagner Group across it. Most of their forces now are comprised of the prisoners recently recruited in Russia. That'll put additional pressure in Soledar. The point of this is to do one of two things. Either outmaneuver Ukrainian forces and their strong defensive lines that have been an issue thus far, or draw forces from other locations, such as Bakhmut itself, in order to soften up defenses in another area for follow-on offensives later in time. But regardless, Bakhmut still holds. Arch Instinct says hello. Hello, Arch Instinct. It's good to see you again. Bakhmut does still hold. Ukrainian forces hold the city of Bakhmut, where there is still very intense fighting. This is one of the most horrific places of the war, where victory is not measured in kilometers, but mere meters, feet, and inches. This is where the war has turned into a slugfest, a war of attrition, and is best described as a meat grinder. The conditions here are absolutely horrendous. World War I style trench fighting, wave attacks, the long, indiscriminate artillery bombardments multiple times a day. It has littered the landscape and made it look more like the Battle of the Somme than it has any modern battlefield that we've seen in the 21st century, or what we would expect to see out of a 21st century war. This war is much more reminiscent of World War I than any other in history, at least in my personal opinion. We also see where the weather, of course, being winter, has taken a turn for the worse. It is cold, wet, and miserable. The trenches are filling with water. The ground has turned into a sea of mud, translated in Russian to rasputitsa. And we see where it is bogged down anything and everything, getting into every nook and cranny and covering every soldier from head to foot. It is the most miserable conditions we have seen truly since the First World War, and we continue to see heavy fighting in these very conditions around Bakhmut, a city entirely destroyed, much like Mariupol.
Пацаны, свои. Ай, блин. Дайте мені пекач, мені надо по 11 работать. Я сам, сука, покажу його, як треба.
Что там, Осман?
Шо, їхнє гніздо.
Как работает мальчик? Как часы?
Идет,
Я буду потихоньку подваливать, корректируй. КамАЗ куда, туда. Подержи.
So I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to the untrained eye, but there is actually a lot of intelligent things happening here. And while you would think, like, why is this guy kind of doing really short bursts? He's not really doing. He's doing exactly what a machine gunner is supposed to do. This is a textbook example of what a machine gunner is. His entire job is. So first of all, my recommendation, man. Take the heat shield off. I know it makes the whole thing look sleek, but the heat shield, in my opinion, and everyone is different, but the heat shield I've always found was just more of a nuisance. Just the straight barrel, it makes it a lot easier to do barrel changes on it, which he should be doing here probably towards the end of the video at some point, or after the video is ended. What's happening here is an assault. The thing is, one of the things that we trained for quite extensively, at least in the Marine Corps, was assaulting a trench line. And what you do is machine guns, so you have mortars and artillery, if you have it, hits the trench line as these teams are moving up, and it allows mortars and this whole huge group of troops to move up, and it suppresses the Russians so that way they're not capable, or it suppresses the enemy that way they have to keep their heads down so that way they don't get hit, but it also makes it so they can't fight back, they can't see what's going on, and it makes it very difficult for them to counter what you're getting ready to do. It allows for mortars and all the other assets to push up, and mortars will set up and they will pick up the suppression. It's going from a really big, less accurate object, and you slowly work your way to you're more accurate. So mortars are going to dial in even closer. They're going to start hitting that trench line. They're going to pick up that suppression, and it's going to keep the enemy's head down. But it has a smaller area of effect, so you can move your infantry closer to them. This guy is set up on this berm right here, on this little ditch, and he has a sight line over the rest of the field, and he has defilade, which is protecting him. But the machine gunner's job is to provide suppressive fire. It's not meant. You can definitely do some really good damage if you know what you're doing with a machine gun, but that's in the right circumstances. His job right now is not to worry about killing anybody, though he probably will. His job is to keep the enemy's head down so that way all these guys on his right-hand side, they can maneuver, they can get close, and they get to do the dirty work once they get to the trench. His job is to make sure that his guys don't get cut down on their way to getting close to the trench. So you see him, he opens fire, he shoots some short bursts, it keeps the enemy's head down, and these guys are providing suppressing fire from their location, and they send, you know, a squad at a time maneuvering up towards that defensive line, but they're keeping dispersed so that way if something was to happen, they don't all get bunched up and they're easily wiped out. Machine guns love for this kind of stuff to happen when troops get bunched up. It's called enfilade fire. It's perfect for a machine gunner. It's also known as the machine gunner's wet dream is to receive enfilade fire on a platoon of dudes. So that is the point of this machine gunner. He is engaging targets periodically. So these guys are providing suppression. He is firing his 240, and he's letting these guys move. He waits till they get past his machine gun, so he pauses, waits till they get past the machine gun, so that way he's not shooting his own guys in the back. And then as soon as these guys get down into defilade, he can start shooting over their heads and continuing to suppress the enemy, so that way these guys can keep moving and they're in immensely less danger. They're not being targeted by the enemy because the enemy has their heads down. They're worried about getting hit. So that is the point. That is what he is doing. That is the point of the machine gunner, and it is textbook example of using what we would call this is a support by fire. He's supporting the infantry. He's supporting the line companies, the rifle squad, to allow them to maneuver, close with, and destroy the enemy. So textbook example, very well done. Definitely an intense video to watch. Also, I gotta love the 240 because the 240, this machine gun, is my baby. It is side-mounted with the Saber system on my vehicle. I have carried the 240, and I have fired a lot from the 240. It is my baby. It is my bread and butter. I have qualified on it. It is the best machine gun, I think, out of all of them. Don't tell the 50 cal that, as it is my side piece. We can see some of the destruction of the city of Bakhmut. Bakhmut has received extensive shelling for the last several months, and it's really ramped up over the last few months since the end of the Luhansk campaign, where the fighting is really centralized around Bakhmut especially in the most recent about month and a half, where we see an extensive amount of fighting for the city of Bakhmut itself. The city is indiscriminately shelled, and the damage is very evident from the videos that we've seen.
Слава Україні! 12 грудня. Рота чорного філя на стоїть працює. Бахмут потихеньку стирають. Після війни багато роботи. Вірте в ЗСУ. Слава Україні!
I have to imagine that this video, while I do not speak Ukrainian or Russian, maybe Fair can fill me in on what he says. Something about Bakhmut, I picked that up enough. But the building is burning in the background, and half of it has been reduced to rubble, and the smoke is still fresh in the air. I have to imagine, based on this guy's demeanor, I just survived this. This place sucks, but at least I'm alive, and I'm pretty happy about that. Slava Ukraini. At this point, these guys are combat hardened. These guys, in some cases, may not even roll out of bed for incoming artillery fire. I know that is something that is a mentality dangerous to have. Complacency kills, but that is a mentality you can get, especially if you're tired enough. But maybe Fair can translate that video for me, so that way I understand what he is saying, because I'm sure it's probably something pretty good. But it looks like he's been through hell, but it's not the worst. This is reportedly an older video coming out from the end of November. This is freshly released footage from the Battle of Bakhmut, so still relevant footage considering the fighting we've seen here. Russian and Ukrainian forces are still in the same general area, and we can kind of see that happening here in Ukraine, or here in Bakhmut, where they continue to fight over, like I said, mere meters of ground is what's being gained or lost through this very bloody war of attrition.
А ну не поди ему туда нахуй! Отошли опять! Давай!
Bookham 40 says, so, new initiative. U.S. government offers leaves of absence for 1 year period. After 1 year, soldier returns to their old billet with no disruption in service. How many soldiers would then go to Ukraine? I have a feeling a lot of servicemen would go to Ukraine. Servicemen and women would go to Ukraine. But that's not ever going to happen. Now, I know it's happened in the past. Don't get me wrong. It has happened, but usually for very select things. Fighter pilots, for instance. Rooster Fontaine says, can you teach trench warfare? Yes, you can. In fact, we don't really use trench warfare. So we don't use trench warfare, but we know that other people do. So we learn how to assault trenches. There are a lot of different training ranges. It's actually one of the more straightforward things to do. I think in warfare, the hardest thing to do is MOUT, which is military operations in urbanized terrain, is what that stands for. Urban fighting is what that boils down to. Fighting house to house, street to street is hands down, I think, the hardest thing you can do in in a combat situation. As far as that's concerned, it is hands down the deadliest. One of the deadliest things you can do. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely mentally tasking, and it's just it's just all around. It sucks, and you count for 80% casualties or more whenever you're expecting to clear a town. It's that bad, just because it's all close quarters. But we can go back to this, which is something I brought out last time. This is, for those that don't know, that may be new to the channel. So I maintain a ton of manuals. Right now, most of my manuals are covered by my pack and some boxes from when we moved some stuff up during my vacation. But that entire bottom shelf on that 4-shelf bookshelf is just nothing but manuals. And I have several that lay around me around here on the floor and on my desk that I reference most often. This one is one that I recently have busted out, and I can go back through again. This is from when I went through the School of Infantry's 0300 course. This is my first month of infantry training, and this is everything that you go through in that first month and that you cover. And you actually cover things like fighting in the defense. Now, fighting in the defense is a skill that you employ very often. Pretty much every single range you will ever do, do you still have the Almighty Book of Knowledge? I will always have the Almighty Book of Knowledge. I am never giving up these manuals ever. But this manual, fighting in the defense, whenever you index at the end of a range, you usually step into a defensive position where you're expected to repel a counterattack, most likely at night or early morning, as nautical evening and morning twilight are the best times to actually attack somebody, for those that don't know, which is why they always tell you to wait for dusk or dawn. Nautical and morning, evening, twilight is the hardest time for depth perception because of the visibility, and it makes it very difficult for even MVGs to operate just because there's so much light to amplify, but not quite enough to be able to see without it. Let's take a look here. Defensive fundamentals, page 322. Well, let's take a look. Let's go to page 322. Now, every job is different. So, if you are operating a machine gun, you have a different job in a defense than an anti-tank missileman who has a different job in the defense. And it's different if you're operating in a trench or in a fighting position, foxhole. We don't call them foxholes in the Marine Corps because foxes go into holes to hide. We definitely ain't there to hide. We call them fighting positions, but for my purposes, a foxhole will do. There's different types of defensive positions you can make, but it's all about location in many cases. And it's location on the big spectrum of having clear field to fire, having a good defensive position. That's for the officers to worry about. That's their job, is to employ and set up their troops in a good position to make them successful. The NCOs are going to worry about the more specific tasks. What machine guns go where in the defensive line? They never go on the ends. Making sure that everyone has mutual supporting fires, that everyone can support each other, that everyone has interlocking fields of fire, and are best covering avenues of approach. That their fighting positions are dug with a draining sump and a grenade sump, and to make sure that no one is going to be standing in 6 feet of water or drowning while they're asleep during a torrential rainfall. To make sure that the wire is set up properly. There's all sorts of things that you have to worry about. There are many different things to worry about when you're talking about you're setting up your defensive line. Let's see if I can find some information here. Hasty fighting position, principles, direction of fire, PDFs. Yep, okay. So, safe sock is always a good one. Security, automatic weapon. So, safe sock or safe so is what they list here. Or so yeah, it's safe sock. So, safe sock is the acronym used for employing in a defense. It stands for security. So, making sure you maintain security while you're digging in the defense in case you're attacked in the middle of digging it. Automatic weapons emplacement. Those are your biggest assets in the defense. Field to fire, making sure everyone is interlocking and that all angles of fire are covered so that way there's no gaps in your line. Entrenchment, actually digging your fighting positions and making sure they're the proper construction. Supplementary positions, because the enemy may not attack your defensive lines in the direction that you're expecting to, or your main line may not hold. So you always have secondary and tertiary positions and supplementary positions. So that way, should something go horribly wrong, as it inevitably does, as no plan survives first contact with the enemy, you will go and you can, if say the attack behind you, well, you're going to have defensive positions behind you. You can move to and set up your positions again in a new place you already have planned, so that way you don't have to worry about hastily having to set something up in the middle of a gunfight. Obstacles is what the O is, and obstacles is setting up things like tripwire flares, or setting up your claymore mines, or setting up your C wire, your razor wire, or what have you, barbed wire, setting up all sorts of things, tripwires and everything else around you to, make it more difficult for the enemy to move on to your position. The last part, C, in Safe Sock, stands for camouflage, because it's even better. It's really good to have a great defensive position. It's even better if you have a great defensive position and the enemy stumbles upon you without having any idea and are immediately annihilated because they walked right in front of your guns and made juicy enfilade fire for your machine guns, which you should have set up in step 2. So, yes, you are taught that. It is something that is teachable. Every skill in the military, in some way, shape, or form, is teachable, but the mentality isn't. The experience isn't. You can teach a lot of things, but I can tell you that when I went into the Marine Corps, I went through a lot of training. I went through this. I went through the almighty book of knowledge. I learned a lot of things about my job in a technical way from a lot of books. And that's the same with all of the manuals that I have. But there was no supplement for the experience that I gained when doing my job and learning from people who were more senior than myself who had done my job. So it's a lot of stuff. It is very important. It's a lot of stuff to learn. A lot of people make the joke that you got to be stupid to be in the infantry. That is one of the most false statements I've ever heard in my life. You have to be a little bit crazy, but stupid, definitely not. Rooster Fontaine says it looked very chaotic. Yeah, it is. War is a firefight. Any engagement is controlled chaos. That is what it is. I mean, there's no other way. I think that is the best description I've ever heard. It's controlled chaos. So you have to be, if you are going to be successful, you have to master the art of controlled chaos. And that is why war is its own form of art. But, of course, for, what is this, the 7th or 8th time now? This is Bakhmut. And tonight it is being shelled with 9S-22M rockets. The 9S-22M is a incendiary munition. Fires thousands of small pellets. It airbursts over a target. It's a 122 millimeter Katyusha rocket fired from a BM-21 Grad system. Grad standing for Hail in Russian, which fires 40 round salvos of Katyushas. It's an MLRS system. They're dumbfire rockets, and these things airburst over their intended target once the timer has been, or once it's actually been preset on the munition itself. It'll detonate overhead. It spreads out all of these incendiary, extremely hot small things, small little pellets, burning at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit that will ignite anything they come in contact with on the ground that is flammable, to include people. The usage of incendiary munitions in a highly concentrated civilian population or around civilian objects or civilian centers is actually a war crime. It's a war crime under the Convention Against Certain Conventional Weapons of the United Nations in 1980. Specifically, it's against Additional Protocol 3 of that convention, where it prohibits the usage in civilian areas by any kind of delivery. And also, it violates rule number 85 of the international humanitarian law, which you can find on the International Committee of the Red Cross's database. And that is rule number 85, which means you cannot use incendiary munitions against personnel unless you can find no other lesser means in order to render someone hors de combat, which means rendering them no longer a combatant, severely wounded to the point they can no longer fight or they surrender. It is considered to be inhumane and is no longer allowed to be used against personnel in a war zone. This flagrantly violates both of those, as they're being used against personnel targets and they're being used in a civilian center. And Fair says, yeah, these are routine now, unfortunately. That is correct. These are routine now. And to do something, once again, systematically, to commit a war crime systematically, to do it over and over and over again, using it as an official tactic of war, according to the 1993 Rome Statute, once again, that is considered to be crimes against humanity. I think after having reported on this same tactic being used in Bakhmut 8 times now, I would say it's systematic, with some very good confidence. Even though I do not need to be a lawyer to give that confidence to you. As you can see, those pellets rain out as they are air bursted over an area, and they are going to ignite everything on the ground that is flammable, to include people. You are flammable when something burns hot enough, and that burns at thousands of degrees. Arsinsync asks, why do you think we haven't seen many suicide drones or ground drones with LMG/AT weapons? We have, but we haven't. Viability, partially. So it's like using a light machine gun, right? On a vehicle, a drone, for instance, on the ground. It's kind of like using a CROWS system. We have a CROWS system. Quite literally, it uses essentially an Xbox controller. I think it's an off-brand Xbox controller, or an Xbox controller that doesn't have the Xbox logo, but is produced by the same company. The CROWS system is a system that sits on top of a vehicle. You can mount a 50 cal to it. You can mount a Mark 19 to it. You can mount a lot of machine guns to it. But there is no gunner. The gunner sits inside the vehicle, looks at a screen through it that is connected to optics on the system itself. It swivels 360 degrees, and you can see everything. You can see everything that is around you in that way. But a gunner's job in a vehicle is to be the eyes and the ears of the vehicle. The gunner has 360 degrees of area around them, and they can see everything that's going on, and they can see minute details that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. So what you gain in survivability, and you lessen the hazard because everyone's inside the vehicle. They're much safer from enemy fire, and in case there's an attack, an IED or a mine or something, they're inside the MRAP, and therefore they will likely survive. You lose in situational awareness, which means you're more likely to hit that IED, or you're more likely to be engaged because you're looking at a camera, through a camera. You don't have that intuition and that peripheral vision. You're glued to whatever is directly ahead of you through the optic. And that's why it can be a very poor choice, and why usually with a convoy for us, we would lead the convoy with a CROW system, because everyone's inside the vehicle, and the first vehicle is the most likely to hit an IED, so they would survive, and everyone would leave with minor injuries should that happen. But every other vehicle would have a real person in the gunner seat, because to lose that situational awareness is absolutely devastating. And all forms of drones and equipment like that, automation, do have that issue. He said he follows that on with, can't just strap a patch of demolitions to a small RC or smaller aerial drone and blow up a trench line. You see it happening now with the usage of hand grenades and rockets and mortars being dropped on Russian positions. But trenches are built in such a way that they're meant to be able to withstand explosions in sections of the trench. That's why they zigzag. So that way it only destroys a portion of the trench and not the whole trench line, and inflicts only minimal casualties. There's a way to build trenches when you're talking about a defensive line, and we've been doing it for a long time. A lot of these methods were perfected in World War I. I say perfected, but very much closely perfected during World War I, and you see that happening here. So it definitely changes. It's not exact, right? So it gets very difficult to make. I'm not saying that it can't be done, because you certainly can. It's been done in the past. I'm sure it's been done in Ukraine, and we just don't get to see it because we get to see very small glimpses into the war itself. But I'm just saying, in reality, it wouldn't do enough. There's much better options to go with. Fair asked, does one volunteer to be in the gunner seat, or is it something that gets assigned? A little bit of both. Part of it is experience and ability. Some people are naturally better as a gunner. There is being a gunner is not very easy. My first deployment, I was a gunner. My unit was a mounted unit. I served in a CAT unit. It stands for a Combined Anti-Armor Team, which is machine gunners and anti-tank missilemen that run around in armored vehicles, MRAPs, MATVs, Humvees, what have you, that operate which operate the tow system. That's the tow tube behind me, and all of the machine guns, which is why I'm a fully cross-trained machine gunner. I had to know all of the machine guns because I could easily be in a 50 cal truck and then easily turn around and get into the Saber Vic and operate the tow system. It could be any of that. It's kind of determined on experience and ability. If you're a better gunner, if you're better in the gunner seat, then you're probably going to be in the gunner seat as long as you're not a vehicle commander or a VC. I was extremely good, and I was good in the gun. I'm not going to say extremely good. I almost did. I was good in the gun. I knew what I was doing. I was very communicative. I was very observant. And when we went outside the wire on deployment for QRF missions, usually I was going out with the mortars, who they knew how to do convoy missions, but it was usually just me and one other person that was from a mounted unit. So we would get in the guns because we knew what to do, and we could coordinate with the other gunners, and they would basically follow our direction. So the experienced people were in the guns, they knew what they were doing, and there wasn't going to be any hiccups because you can't lose. These vehicles only have one gun. You can't lose that capability. You need someone who knows what they're doing. So if the gun jams, there's something that goes wrong, you need someone who knows what to do, then knows how to look at that gun, determine, like it's second nature, that it's, that what needs to be done, if it's completely broken, if there's anything that can be done to get that gun into the fight in a very short amount of time, or if they got to pull the 249 out the back or their rifle from the side, or to know when you feel that vehicle is trying to tip over, what to do so that way they aren't crushed underneath the vehicle and the turret or what have you. There's a lot that goes into it. Sometimes it's volunteer, sometimes it's assignment, sometimes it's just you're the best guy for the job. It really depends. Every unit's a little different. Every platoon and section's a little different. So that's just kind of how that goes. And it evolves over time too, as you have guys that kind of fit into a certain role that they're really good at. Everyone has a chance in the gun, but if the guy, but eventually everyone fits in. This guy prefers the drive and he's a better driver. This guy's better at a dismount. This guy is better at as a gunner. And this guy's a VC because he's a team leader. Yeah, there's been a lot of really cool quadcopters. Arsenal says, I forget if the Soviet mortar bombs they use are 60 millimeter or 88 millimeter. Soviet mortars, so everyone has a 60 millimeter mortar essentially, but Soviet, I would say medium-sized mortars. So they would be, we use 81s. We use 81 millimeter mortars as our battalion level assets, at least in the Marine Corps. That's why we just call the 81s, we call them 81s. Russian mortars are 82 millimeters. They use 82 millimeter mortars, the Pondos, and they are specifically designed to be 82 millimeter because they can take American and NATO standard 81 millimeter mortar rounds and use them in their tubes whenever they do tactical site exploitation, or TSE. Whereas for us, if we were to capture a Soviet position or a Russian position in an all-out war between the United States and NATO versus Russia or the Soviet Union, we can't exploit their mortars and use 82 millimeter mortar rounds in our tubes, because they'll either get stuck in the tubes once they get past the bad, or they would not be able to fit in the tube at all. Jumping over here into Ermino. Ermino had a large ammunition depot reportedly that was struck by Ukrainian forces. The explosion occurred within the city. So we're looking, while it's not official that it was a strike by Ukrainian troops, definitely does fit what we've seen from Ukrainian forces before, whenever they employ the HIMARS system, which has been very coveted, or its sister systems such as the M270 Mars II systems donated by Germany, the United Kingdom, and France.
Ебать! Блять! О, это... Ебать! Ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой! Ой-ой-ой-ой! Ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой! Бля. А! Да нормально, вот там вообще.
That's a nice big boom. That always makes my day seeing an ammo depot go up quite like that. And we know you can hear it's an ammo depot because you can hear some of the small arms ammunition cooking off after the explosion. It's an ammunition depot in Armino, which is here. It's actually just across the border in the Luhansk Oblast, and it's a relatively large-sized town, which is likely being used as an ammunition dump. Hey, Pure Loyalist, always happy to see you come back, man. I'm glad to see that you at least popped in for a quick hello. You can deck, so we are getting into the holiday season, and it's starting to get time to, if you haven't already, as I have here at our home, it's time to deck the halls, or in this case, trenches. And instead of some bows, we have some quadcopter drones. Huh. Very fitting for the trenches. It's at least they're getting in some of the holiday spirit. But on a less happy topic, though, we move over into Kryvyi Rih. Kryvyi Rih is in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and it was struck with Russian missiles as well. One of these missiles ended up striking an apartment complex here in Kryvyi Rih, and as a result of the strike, 2 people were killed and another 13 wounded, 4 children among them. You can see the destruction on that apartment building coming from the official Twitter of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. We can see here some of the destruction from Kryvyi Rih via a local news channel. Completely collapsed sections of that building. Euromaidan. Rescue efforts are still ongoing. coming from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So quite an immense amount of damage, and unfortunately loss of life, and unfortunately a lot of people wounded. Rooster Fontaine says, you'd think trench warfare would be outdated. There's never a time, if you're ever in combat, you learn to love the taste of dirt. There was some discoveries in the Kherson region that once again shows that Russia is war profiteering. Same reason that the same kind of thing that began this channel seems to be rearing its head in Russia, as was expected. A packing slip was found in one of the caches of abandoned ammunition left in the Kherson region that showed 152 millimeter rounds, which are artillery shells, that were manufactured just this year. They were meant to be shipped to Azerbaijan, which means that Russia has been arming Azerbaijan in its war with Armenia, despite their public position as the defenders of Armenia under the CSTO. Meaning that they have been playing both sides in the war. They have not been supportive of Armenia. They are supplying Azerbaijan with artillery and ammunition to continue that war, to continue that conflict. There's the packing slip for you. Russian shelling ended up killing one person today. Russian aggressors fired missiles at residential areas in Kherson at night on December 16th. A local high-rise building was damaged. One person was killed. 3 citizens were injured and received medical care. End quote. That's coming from the press service of the Kherson Regional Prosecutor's Office. And unfortunately, humanitarian aid work is dangerous work, especially in crisis areas and conflict zones. A member of the Ukrainian Red Cross was killed while in the line of duty during the shelling of Kherson yesterday as well. The Red Cross is the only organization which is listed by name within the Geneva Conventions as being a humanitarian, non-governmental organization and is protected under the laws of war. While all other humanitarian groups are protected, the Red Cross is the only one listed by name. Earlier this year, Russian forces targeted a Red Cross evacuation base located near the front lines with artillery fire, severely damaging the base itself and their vehicles, though no casualties were reported at that time. Coming from the United Nations, they send their condolences. I'm appalled by the death of an aid worker who was killed together with another civilian during an attack in Kherson today. Coming from yesterday. That is the humanitarian coordination, the head of the humanitarian coordination in Ukraine, Denise Brown. The International Committee of the Red Cross's president commented as well, offering her deepest condolences. As does the International Committee of the Red Cross operating in Ukraine. And the official statement by the Red Cross in Ukraine, who showed a censored photo of the scene after the death of one of their workers. He said, today during the mass shelling in Kherson, a volunteer of the Ukrainian Red Cross emergency response team was killed. The Ukrainian Red Cross expresses its condolences with the family of the deceased people. But no matter how bad the war gets, as tonight's topic is, the Russians can't cancel Christmas. I've seen several different things today regarding Christmas and the holidays in Ukraine. And it's, a lot of it's kind of striking. Of course, Carol the Bells, or Shidrik, is being played many, many times across the world this time of year, in every store and in every shopping area in the world, and in many people's homes. Personally, it's my favorite Christmas song and my favorite song for the holidays. And Mykolaiv, which has suffered under extensive Russian shelling for a very long time now, is refusing to give up. And in the spirit of the holidays, and also in recognition of the war as it moves into this holiday season, Mykolaiv has decided to put up a Christmas tree, but a very special one. This Christmas tree is decorated, but it is comprised of camouflage netting. Even in one of the worst wars that we've seen in our lifetimes, you still can't cancel Christmas. The resolve of the Ukrainian people just blows my mind. It's immensely hopeful to see. And with that concludes all of the news inside the country of Ukraine. But that's not the only news happening in the world tonight, as there are many things happening all throughout the world. And we begin our nights in Russia. And in Russia, it would appear that there are supposed to be more missiles, but they didn't even get to their target. Maintenance is very important, and that goes for all of your munitions and weapon systems. However, Russia doesn't appear to have that. And we've seen how decrepit their stuff is before. We have another failure of a very important missile system. One of their ballistic missiles, which was fired towards Ukraine, decided it wanted to go rogue and ended up plowing itself into a field here in the Volgorod Oblast.
Что-то прилетело. Вон какая-то ракета на поле лежит. Блять, плохо видать. Вот оттуда вот. Блять, смотри, как ковырнуло аж, блять. Да все, вот они ехали, и остановились. Смотри, посадки тут вырвали. Вон, смотри, ошметки. Вот что-то сбили. А вот этот нельзя приблизить? Что это за клочок, Андрюх? Где? Поближе приведи. Я никак не могу.
And so that is the missiles that decided to slam into the ground there in the Volgorod Oblast. Yes, for those that don't know, when I went on vacation, which is why we hadn't been streaming for about a week, we went down to get, when I moved from California after the end of my military career, where I moved to here, we couldn't have animals. And so we had a couple of animals. This is Gabby. Gabby is a miniature dachshund. She is adorable. She is also a goofball. Say hello. Say hello. You can say hello. She's a little goofball with really bad breath. And so she is... But she is a little sweetheart. So we ended up getting her and her sister, which is my original cat. Inky. Inky is a very chunky 17.5-pound domestic short-haired black cat who is not very interested in being on screen right now. But so we now have both of our cats and our dog. And it has been a very, very fun, nice couple of days. Unfortunately, I've had to work since I got home, so I haven't been able to spend a lot of time with them because, like I said, I've been at work. But yes, so you will see more animals. We have more than just Tally, my loyal co-host, who was trying to hog all the attention while I was researching, making it very difficult considering she likes to stand in front of me, in front of my keyboard. So, but yes, you will see. Gabby, that's not your toy. And she doesn't bother to listen to me. So yes, that is our egg. That is our thing there, which is one of the reasons why it's going to be more loud during the streams, and I do apologize, but my house is already our animals' entire worlds. I'm not going to restrict them by locking them out of rooms at certain parts of the day. Over here, this is in Ulan-Ude, we saw where there was an Mi-8 that ended up crashing. In fact, it crashed before it even was really able to do anything. It's a brand new Mi-8 that crashed. An Mi-8 is a transport helicopter, and it crashed right there while it was getting ready to be flown to its manufacturer, or from the manufacturer to the Russian army, or the Russian military. So it crashed upon takeoff. It was a catastrophic destruction of the aircraft. Now, it's not exactly known what the cause of the crash is, but considering it's a brand new aircraft, one of the things that I have tried to keep in mind and that I think may be the root cause of the crash is the fact that there are Russia's been under sanctions. Russia's been under sanctions, the heaviest sanctions ever imposed on any country in history, and that has limited them from getting lots of parts. Parts for things like electrical components, microchips, things needed to make some of these systems that are required for aircraft, guided missiles, armored vehicles, and all sorts of other, fancy technical equipment that are necessary to make these things operate. And so it's very possible that sanctions may have impacted that because they had to find an alternative, likely an alternative that's worse than what they already have, or what they had to begin with. So that's maybe the root cause of this crash. It's not definitive, but it is something to definitely keep in mind as we're taking a look at this. But it was a catastrophic destruction of the aircraft, as we can see here. Fair. There we go. Oh, the old ball bearing shortage. Yeah, probably. No parts equals engineers have nothing to do equals engineers get mobilized. Yeah, there you go. That could also be part of it. Over here in Berlin, there was art that was dedicated to Ukrainian women. Innerfields, an art collective from Berlin, created a mural in their hometown entitled Absent, dedicated to Ukrainian women who lost their loved ones in the war. And that is the mural, and it is very touching to see. While casualty numbers have not been officially released, even though I do believe I heard Ursula von der Leyen misspeak at one point, which I did not show here on the channel because I thought it was a slip-up that needs not be repeated or emphasized. Regarding Ukrainian casualties, we do know that there is extensive amounts of casualties on the Ukrainian side. It's a war of attrition, and wars go both ways. While Ukraine is winning, it's come at a very high cost, and so unfortunately, there are a lot of Ukrainian, especially Ukrainian men. There are a lot of Ukrainian women too, but a lot of Ukrainian men, predominantly the ones in the armed forces, that are not coming home. We jump down here and into Turkey. We're coming out of Diyarbakir in Turkey. 9 people were injured after a car exploded. 9 people were injured in an explosion in the province of Diyarbakir. The car filled with explosives was detonated when an official minibus of the Turkish Ministry of Internal Affairs passed by. 8 police officers and 1 civilian were among the injured. The security forces detained a man who is suspected of having left the car on the side of the road and set off an IED. A taxi driver who took the suspect from the scene of the crime and 3 unnamed people were also detained. No one has yet taken responsibility for the attack.
Buradaymış orası çocuklarla.
You can see that here. So that is the IED attack there in Turkey. Arsenal says he's got his fellow today. Congratulations. Welcome to the fellowship. They're in a weird place with wounded numbers as some heal and return to multiple times. That is true, yes. When it comes to military casualties, and you'll never really hear us talk about military casualties on this channel, there's a reason for that. One, it's operational security, especially for Ukraine. We don't want to... We have a bias for Ukraine on this channel. It's very clearly stated. We try to remain apolitical and unbiased in a lot of aspects on this channel, because it's meant to be informative. I'm not trying to sway a viewer one way or another, and I very much try to the best of my ability to be factual on this, to be unbiased, and also try and give you a picture and allow for you to determine your thoughts, your feelings, and your opinions on that, on the subjects, one way or the other on your own. I'm not interested in trying to... I just want to tell people what's going on and let them have an opportunity to do good things, but also allowed to formulate your own opinions. I think the death of the Fourth Estate is probably one of the worst things that ever happened in history. So we do have a bias for Ukraine here, and it's not in a good interest to report Ukrainian casualties outside of very small incidents where we can very clearly say this is what has happened, usually in material losses. Like yesterday, there were several MRAPs which were abandoned, destroyed, or damaged in a failed assault. Because it's important to show, it's a war, it goes both ways. Not everything is a Ukrainian victory. Some things are Russian victories, some things are Ukrainian failures for a counteroffensive. Not everything is successful. Not everything is hunky-dory. Life sucks. It's a war. It goes both ways. The enemy always gets a say. It's important to talk about that too, because to not talk about Ukrainian war crimes, whenever that comes up, to not talk about failures militarily, is to not be honest about what's happening. Is to be lying about what's happening. But talking about the actual casualty figures is equally lying, in my opinion. It's on that same scale. It's misinformation. We will not know the actual casualty figures for this war for a very long time. And I don't mean once the war ends. I mean a long time after the war ends, if we ever do. Because they will be finding... Unfortunately, they will likely be finding graves and stuff from occupation and what have you for a very long time. Not including the people that were sent to Russia, that were forcefully deported. Not including the children which were taken and forcefully deported, which is genocide under the 1949 Geneva Conventions. And that's not including the people that will be injured or killed as a result of unexploded ordnance after the war ends for decades to come. So we will not have accurate numbers. And Russia is going to understate their casualty numbers, which they don't even release anymore. And then Ukraine, I believe, is going to overstate casualty numbers. Purposefully or not, doesn't matter, but they will be overstated. If you go by the battle damage assessments of the U.S. military during the invasion of Iraq, we killed the Iraqi army 7 times over in its entirety. That is not physically possible and did not happen. The commanders on the ground weren't trying to do that, but that is what it turned out to do. So take these numbers with a grain of salt. Do keep that in mind, but that is why we don't report casualty numbers. We don't want it to be demoralizing, and we also don't want to misinform you. And yeah, but it's very important to state biases. It's very important to be honest and to not be misleading or trying to get for that juicy story. It's the news. Just be factual about it. Coming out of Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, which is right here on the middle Euphrates River Valley here in Syria, the deconfliction line, a large Islamic State weapons cache was found. The soldiers of the SAR, the Syrian Arab Republic, Armed Forces, discovered a large cache of Islamic State militants in the province of Deir ez-Zor. The military seized weapons, equipment, IEDs, and commercial quadcopters that the jihadists used for reconnaissance and filming propaganda videos. They also used them as armed drones. When you see this weapons cache here, you can see the PKMs, ammunition, you name it, they got it. Propaganda materials. They make, like this right here, they will take these and they will post them to every single like telephone pole. Like they will just staple them to telephone poles. You're constantly taking down flyers and stuff when if you're going out, if you're even doing it at all. Sometimes you just let the Kurds do it. But yeah, they're everywhere. The Islamic State has a presence. They don't have a caliphate, but they have a presence. They just remain low in many ways until they see an opportunity. So that's what you see there. You see medical supplies, of course. They're going to have wounded too. Hand grenades. They'll take quadcopters, and really, they are the ones to pioneer this. Ukraine has just industrialized it and has become much more ingenuitive. But they put a lot of hand grenades, and they'll take hand grenades and they'll put them on quadcopters. You can buy them for like $15 on Amazon, and they'll get these commercial quadcopters and they'll wire a rig to it to drop hand grenades, and they'll fly over the post and they'll drop a hand grenade on the post. It's extremely dangerous and it's extremely difficult to counter. We had that issue when I was in Syria. Very luckily, I encountered only one armed drone the whole time in Syria. It was one of the very first nights I was in country. I was standing post with someone who has already been there for a bit. And we were keeping our eyes open. We had a lot of drone activity, mostly just surveilling us. They weren't doing anything. There was one drone that I couldn't see, and that my post partner couldn't see, but another post could, that was coming towards us. And for the life of me, I couldn't see it, because you can usually, with your NVG, see the little blinking light on it because it amplifies light. And couldn't see it, and all of a sudden there's a fireball that lit up over lit up over an empty part of our little fire base that we had, and it turned out it was an armed drone, and there was a malfunction. It detonated on the drone over an empty part of the base and didn't cause any damage or anything, but made a nice fireball in the air. But that was the only time I encountered one. But I knew that it was a thing. That was something that we had been warned about. Was really surprised they didn't try it more. But that was always a risk. That was always a concern. That's something that we always had to worry about. Drones and dropping hand grenades. And you see there. Yep, just little quadcopters, like I said. I think this one might have the rig. Yeah, that has the grenade rig on it. I think this one might too. I think that, yeah, I think that's the hand grenade rig on it. And these are probably just for surveillance. Lots of mortar rounds. They don't need the best stuff. That just needs stuff that does explode. And most of those will turn into IEDs. Down here in southern Lebanon, a UN peacekeeper was killed by an unidentified gunman. An Irish UN peacekeeper was killed and several others were wounded when unidentified attackers opened fire on a convoy in southern Lebanon. The Irish Defence Forces said in a statement that a pair of armored vehicles carrying 8 Irish troops from the UN peacekeeping mission known as UNIFIL was fired on as they drove north towards Beirut on Wednesday night near the town of Al-Akhbiya. Our condolences do go out to that UN peacekeepers, friends, and family. In Jordan, protests erupted in some Jordanian cities. Dissatisfied citizens demand active support from the population in overthrowing the royal regime. Military units were introduced into the capital, Amman. Several riots also engulfed the city of Al-Karak. It is known that there are unconfirmed reports of protesters attempting to take over administrative buildings. You see military units moving in here. As we continue eastward, we come over here. This is on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, where new skirmishes have been reported between the Taliban and Pakistani border guards in the Spin Buldak and Shaman districts. The reason for which is the Taliban tried to establish their checkpoint here, and the Pakistani border guards, trying to prevent this, opened fire on them. There were no reports of immediate casualties.
ملګرو دا د کلیه کې ومرسله ګوله دا خاص په کلیه کې ومرسله دلته راورسېدو بغرا روډ ته راورسېدو ټرافیک ټول جام دی ډېر خلک راوتلي دي.
Arch and Sneak asked what vehicles were Jordan moving in. Those were M113 armored personnel carriers that were on the back of those flatbed trucks. Those were M113 armored personnel carriers. Another aggravation on the Pakistani-Afghan border led to civilians getting hurt. The conflict took place in the province of Balochistan in the Shaman border crossing. Both sides opened fire on each other with small arms and mortars. Later, the Pakistani armed forces pulled armored vehicles to the site of the clash, deployed combat helicopters, and attacked the Taliban from heavy artillery. At the moment, 11 people have been injured, including women and children. Pakistani authorities evacuated civilians from Shaman district. One of the field commanders of the Taliban movement announced the start of negotiations with the Pakistani armed forces on a ceasefire. Both sides obviously pulling quite a bit of forces into the fray there. Argentine says EU gross are using American tanks to suppress civil rights. It's an American design, yes, but they're not American vehicles. The M113 is one of the most common armored personnel carriers ever built by the United States, used heavily in Vietnam, and has been sold to pretty much every country that the United States has ever been on a friendly relationship to. Keep in mind, Iran also has F-15s. Or F-14 Tomcats. If not, either I can't remember if it's F-14 Tomcats or F-15 Strike Eagles, but they have American jets from right before the regime change in 1979. So, there's American hardware out there that may not necessarily be, being used for good purposes. The Islamic State has M16s. I mean, it happens. I mean, Russian equipment's used everywhere. We never talk about that. We never. I mean, no one cares about that. But once again, the AK-47, inherently the gun of the bad guy, as we know it now. But the AK-47, AK-74 systems, AKMs, PKMs, like that, immediately sets off. Oh, that's probably a bad guy, because unless you're working in a NATO country, or unless you're in a NATO country, and even some NATO countries heavily, we'd heavily, use the AK. I mean, that's just what's available. It's cheap. It was produced everywhere. You have to have a chart based off of how many countries produce the AK to determine where it's at. Because there's 3 different stamps on every AK that tells you where it's been made. So, yeah, it's quite impressive. Down here, coming out of Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, landslide in Malaysia campsite ended up killing 21. Landslide killed 21 people, including children, while they slept in their tents at an unlicensed campsite in Malaysia. Landslide in Selangor, state bordering the capital of Kuala Lumpur, occurred just before 3 a.m. or 19 Greenwich Mean Time, tearing down a hillside into an organic farm that officials said was operating the campsite illegally. There were 94 people caught in the landslide, but 61 were safe, with 12 missing, according to the Malaysian National Disaster Management Agency. 7 people were injured, including a pregnant woman, while others had wounds ranging from minor cuts to a suspected spinal injury. If you'd like more on that, you can check out Reuters. Who makes the best AKs? I don't know. I'm not an AK fan. I personally have an AR-15, so I prefer the AR platform. I'm okay with an AK. I know how to use one. I went through a foreign weapons instructor's course, so I am able to operate most Soviet-style arms with some levels of varying degrees of confidence based off of whatever I have, with what little experience I have with them. First started learning about the AK, never handled an AK or anything until I actually went on my first deployment. And then the regimental armory, I went and I handled AKs and stuff. I wouldn't say all the time, but extensively enough, because the regimental armory, not the battalion armories, but the regimental armory had foreign weapons instructor course weaponry. including the Dishkas, the RPKs, RPDs, AK-74s, AK-74Us, AK-47s, and AK-Ms to be used. So for instruction purposes. So I got fairly confident with it, but I don't know. Ukraine builds a mean T-34. I'll give him that. Fair says that thing bruised my shoulder when I tried it. It's the AK is not that. It doesn't fire that big of a round. It really doesn't. It means that you didn't shoulder it correctly, is what that means. You got to toughen up that arm. Got to toughen up that shooting shoulder. This is if you're a lefty, or if you're a righty. I can shoot ambidextrously, but my marksmanship is right-shouldered. I'm predominantly a right-shouldered, but I learned to shoot ambidextrously to at least a capable degree. Jumping down into Africa, we jump over here to where the Democratic Republic of the Congo has successfully eradicated guinea worm disease. The World Health Organization, WHO, announced that it had certified the Democratic Republic of the Congo as free of transmission of Adrenoculus medinicis, the parasite that causes dracunculiasis, or guinea worm disease. The announcement was made by Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the WHO Director General, following a recommendation of the International Commission of the Certification of, I'm not going to pronounce that again, Eradication, or the ICCDE, at its 16th meeting. The virtual meeting was on the 22nd of November. If you'd like some more information on that, go and check out Relief Web International. Ferris says, I'm left-handed but right-eye dominant, so it's an iffy balance. I know people that are cross shooters, but there is a way to actually do that for marksmanship. Unfortunately, here in Kinshasa, here in the DRC, 169 people ended up dying due to heavy rainfall. As of the 16th of December, at least 169 people have died and around 30 were injured and receiving treatment in hospitals across the city, and at least 280 houses were destroyed after floods caused by heavy rains in Kinshasa on December 12th through the 13th. Mont-Ngafula and Negalima are the hardest hit areas by the heavy downpour, which have affected around 38,000 people across the city. Coming from the United Nations here in the DRC. I do apologize about my pronunciation, by the way. I barely speak English, but I do at least make a solid attempt at trying to do these pronunciations. And Bangui, the head of the Russian Cultural Center, was hospitalized. Unknown people made an attempt on the head of the Russian Cultural Center here in Bangui. The incident took place in the country's capital. The Russian reportedly received a package from an anonymous sender with an IED that went off in his hands. The man was hospitalized with severe injuries. The Central African Republic's authorities qualified the incident as a terrorist attack. No one has yet taken responsibility for the explosion. There are reports in the media that the victim received letters twice with threats and demands for the Russian to leave Africa. And in Timbuktu, here in Mali, 2 UN peacekeepers were killed in an armed attack. Unidentified men opened fire on a United Nations police or UNPOL patrol in Timbuktu town on December the 16th. The attack left 2 UN peacekeepers dead, including a woman. 4 other peacekeepers were injured, one of them seriously. They are currently receiving appropriate care at the MINUSMA military hospital in Timbuktu. One assailant was neutralized and equipment recovered. The MINUSMA quick reaction force was immediately dispatched to secure the area. And we jump over here and into Washington, D.C., where an additional $2 billion USD will be going to assistance for food insecurity. The U.S. President Joe Biden announced another $2 billion in humanitarian assistance to address the acute food insecurity in Africa during the U.S. African Leaders Summit closing session on promoting food security and food systems resilience. The U.S. has reportedly committed $11 billion this year for efforts relieving global food insecurity. We do have those remarks from the White House direct, which we can see here regarding that. So that is all of the hard-pressing news happening throughout the world. And like every single night, we're going to try and end on a good or an interesting note. And tonight, it's going to be an interesting one. Down here, Tel Al Amarna, which is here just south of, or to the south of Cairo in Egypt, an Egyptian ring featuring a god of fun was discovered in an ancient burial mound. Archaeologists in Egypt have unearthed stunning gold jewelry, including a ring depicting the god of fun in a burial that's more than 3,300 years old. The burial is located in the northern part of modern-day Amarna, about 186 miles or 300 kilometers to the south of Cairo. This city was built by Pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried to change Egypt's polytheistic religion by focusing it around the worship of the Aten, the sun disk. The recently discovered jewelry includes the engraved image of Bes, who is known as the god of fun, the statement said. Ancient images of Bes are often found in Egypt. The deity is depicted as a dwarf who, in addition to playing music and having fun, also protected women during childbirth. Another ring contains an Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription with the name Sat-I Plant Tawi, which means Lady of the Earth. We can see those rings here. So, pretty cool. If you want some more information on that, feel free to go and check out their article there at Live Science, which covers that topic a little bit more in depth and probably is going to know a lot more about it than I do, unfortunately. I do have some interest in ancient Egypt, but that's not usually where my historical focus is. Though my family is very interested in ancient Egyptian history, so maybe I can go and ask one of them for some more insight. But that is everything news-wise in the world tonight. It's been a little bit of a long night, which I can understand. Hope that everyone is going to be getting some good solid rest after tonight's stream. I know I certainly will be. But most of all, I hope that you and your family and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the near future. There's a lot of stuff that's happening, throughout the world. I'll know a lot of you are in the United States, which has our own issues, of course. I know some of you guys do live abroad, and I'm a lot closer to some of these issues. So I hope that you guys do, get that safety and security. I hope that you guys are staying safe, staying warm, taking care of yourselves, even with everything going on in the world. And I do hope that you're in a good place mentally too, because I know that this stuff, at least for me, can be very mentally taxing, and I know it is for everyone else too, keeping up for it. So please be sure to check out the video description and check out all those wonderful organizations. I know it may be dark times, but at least let's try and put some good back into it, put a little bit of light into that darkness by helping to raise money and support people that are affected by these very situations all throughout the globe. It's terrible enough, maybe we can help them in some way, shape, or form. So once again, 80% or more of all the donations those organizations receive do go to their programs and go to helping people all throughout the globe with whatever their cause is that they're supporting at that time. We have them all listed in the description below and on our website. And if you have any more, please send them to us. If you can't give a lot to these organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. One of the biggest things you can do is help support the channel by giving us a like and a subscribe, commenting and sharing this stuff among your friends, family, communities, all on the internet. You can follow us on Twitter, or you can join our Discord and just kind of spread the word. The more people that come here, the more people that become informed, and the more people that are here that are potentially able to donate and able to help people throughout the world. And the more people that join the community, the bigger of an impact this community will have as a force of good. We're never monetizing this. We don't believe in taking money based off of people suffering. We just want to help the world and make sure that you know what's happening around you. Please be safe. I will talk to you guys tomorrow in our next stream at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Central, for a 24 hours of news and review. With that, my name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic and very restful and pleasant rest of your night tonight. All right, bye now.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всі хвосту змішаємо з багном. І стояду волноваги, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлепуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоя до волноваги, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям плечом, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 тысяч лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоя до волноваги, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your top 11, shove it up your wrinkle bomb. Oh, we'll come and help you fit it in your skull.
Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоя до волноваги, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоя до волноваги, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.